But let's go across to our reporters now. We're joined by Vishnu, Parmeshwar and Vasudha from there near the Bharat Mandapam at the Pragati Maidan complex. And Vishnu, first to you, already a big achievement at the G20 under India's presidency with the inclusion of the African Union.
Yeah, so that's an absolutely big statement there from the Prime Minister. The inclusion of the African Union is something that India has been pushing for. India has been pushing for the African Union in the context of being a voice of the global South. This is something which has been welcomed by African nations and it makes the entire G20 process a lot more inclusive, and certainly from an Indian standpoint, demonstrates the spread, the depth and the growing influence of our foreign policy.
That's right, Vishnu, and now the session has begun, and there's been a lot of talk about whether we're going to have that final joint statement by the G20, by all the world leaders, something which will be agreed on by everyone. We know there have been sticking points.
I think in answer to that question, the Prime Minister actually spoke about and used the words trust deficit. He said that there is a profound trust deficit which exists in the world presently. And I think the point that he was mentioning is that for there to be greater prosperity at multiple levels and certainly to tide over the differences that exist presently, then this trust deficit needs to be avoided. We need to get rid of this trust deficit. And therefore, I think it was a message which was very directly targeted at perhaps different strands of thoughts from different nations and different leaders in the G20 process. Because if that trust deficit does evaporate, does move away, then yes, Gargi, tomorrow we should have a Delhi G20 declaration. Anything short of that would at one level be a small disappointment, but perhaps would still be substantial because it would reflect all of what else has been achieved.
That's right. Parmeshwar, the other, focus point has been the bilaterals. Yesterday, the Prime Minister already held 3 bilaterals with Mauritius, with Bangladesh, and then the big one with President Joe Biden in the evening talks and dinner at the President's, at his home there. Tell us more about, because we do know there are going to be 15 bilaterals in all during this G20 weekend.
Well, Gargi, as you mentioned correctly, there were 3 bilaterals that took place yesterday. But the venue for the bilaterals yesterday was 7 LKM, the Prime Minister's residence. Joe Biden, in fact, went straight from the airport to the Prime Minister's residence for the bilateral talks, and lots came out of it, as we've covered. For today, bilaterals are planned with the United Kingdom, Japan, Italy and Germany. Again, all eyes are on these bilaterals, which are happening in the breaks between the 2 sessions that are planned today. But the leaders are all here. The inaugural remarks have been made by the Prime Minister. As we've seen, interesting optics with the Bharat nameplate and the Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas reference also. But as the Prime Minister pointed out, crucially, there are 3 things for New Delhi to tackle as far as these 2 sessions are concerned. A trust deficit post the pandemic, post the effects of COVID and post the effects of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. Secondly, the push for African Union to be integrated into the G20 grouping, just like the European Union has. And the third being that we need to unite to find common solutions to old problems. In a sense, again, pushing forward the whole multilateralism aspect as India has.
Absolutely. And Vasudha, we also, this morning as the Prime Minister greeted all the leaders, the Konark Wheel in the backdrop, there's been a lot of, you're there, you've been there since yesterday at Pragati Maidan and the Bharat Mandapam, and it's been quite a talking point, the kind of arrangements that have been made and also, the kind of heritage constructs that are there right now with the Natraj, with the giant Natraj and the Konark Wheel in the backdrop.
That's right, Gargi. The Konark Wheel is it's a very known symbol in India. All of us know that the Konark Sun Temple is a UNESCO World Heritage, and it is something that, it's considered a representation of India's 15th century, and it is something that also represents Kal Chakra. So there is, of course, a link to India's ancient religion, Hinduism, where we talk about Kal, time and death, and talk about the limited finity of life. So in a way, it was also very intelligent of them to keep it there, because G20 presidency of India is marked by a lot of positives, but also there's this conflict, world conflict that's going on between Ukraine and Russia, and the leaders' declaration is based on what kind of consensus India is able to bring about. So this Konark Wheel Chakra was placed today, and it was only with US President Joe Biden that Prime Minister Narendra Modi made that extra effort. He basically was seen in the visuals, explaining to him what this visual is, what the Kal Chakra symbolizes. And like I said, it symbolizes the finity of life. Time, death, Kal have very significant meanings in Hinduism, and that is probably why it was kept there, and also for the diversity of it. Remember, India's G20 presidency has also been used to showcase the diversity of the country. So, like you said, Nataraja is welcoming, this huge statue of Nataraja is welcoming visitors, and that has come all the way from Swamimalai in Tamil Nadu. So this is another replica that represents the Eastern cultural heritage of India. So all in all, this is all a move to also showcase the cultural richness and diversity of the country.
Right, Vasudha, and talking about, the current geopolitics and the tension, so a huge balancing act for India, and that's been a big challenge for us. Russia is not, Vladimir Putin isn't here, and Xi Jinping isn't here. Joe Biden is here, and for India, to manage all these relationships and tensions, that's been one of the big challenges of our global presidency, of the G20 presidency.
Absolutely, Gargi. I think that is why it is going to be a next 2 days of intense negotiations, because apart from climate action, where there are minor disagreements, the important point of contention is, of course, on the language or the formulation that will be used to describe what is happening between Russia and Ukraine. Remember, this was also a bone of contention in the Bali Declaration. Russia, of course, has said that the situation has changed. Yesterday, we saw the Russian Foreign Ministry also issue a statement saying that India is under pressure of G7 countries to issue a statement that projects a unilateral stance, whereas India wants to be neutral. Of course, the G7 countries have been pushing for a very strong statement on against Russia. China, of course, has said that G20 is not the right platform to discuss geopolitics. India, for many years, for many months, has been saying that diplomacy and dialogue is the only way forward. So other than that, to override this big question and this big point of conflict, India has been really working hard in the last 10 months to showcase positive agenda, to talk about things that actually matter, be it increasing need for digitalization in public governance, be it pushing DPI and UPI, or for that matter bringing reforms in multilateral developmental banks like World Bank, restructuring of banks to ensure that debts are given to developing countries, and most importantly, speaking for developing countries and emerging as the voice of the global south, apart from pushing for the inclusion of the African Union. So this is what India has been trying to do to ensure that, this elephant in the room, the Ukraine-Russia conflict, does not really overshadow the actual agenda of India's G20 presidency.
All right, and the leaders have now gone in for those talks. And Vishnu, if you could just broadly take us through what is expected for viewers who are tuning in. The G20 Summit has begun. Talks will take place. They will break for lunch. And the big focus at the start of the talks is going to be on the issue of climate action.
I think a couple of key issues over here which the Prime Minister has referred to and we need to talk about. Firstly, he's spoken about a profound trust deficit which exists in the world. And I think it's important in the context of reaching out to all of the leaders present, the G20 leaders, to say, break that trust deficit, let us get together and let us work towards that Delhi declaration of the G20. What are the key sticking points? Well, there are a couple. One of them is the language associated with climate change. In fact, the US National Security Advisor has spoken to the media about that and has actually said that China has certain concerns as far as that language on climate change is concerned. Now, what those specific concerns are, we do not know, but essentially the implication was that China should not hold hostage this entire process with regard to language. It is something, climate tech, and is something which is important for the entire world. So no aspect of climate needs to be looked at from any prism other than trying to help other nations, number one. Number two, the great issue, the great area of global distrust, of course, is Ukraine and Russia, and how the West and several other countries in the world have very differing standpoints as far as the war over there is concerned. So that is another area which the Prime Minister would suggest that there is a trust deficit which needs to be moved out. But I think the big takeaway from his brief introductory remarks was the inclusion, or the potential inclusion of the African Union, whether it would be the African Union, as part of the G20, or whether this ultimately becomes G21, is something we need to look at subsequently. But that's another key point. So that is one big takeaway for India. We remain the voice of the global south. All of this will come up in discussions. Let's see if we can actually get together, all of these countries, break through that trust deficit and come out with a big declaration tomorrow.